On today's episode of Locked On Wild, three big things John Hynes had to say after a big win against Toronto.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we take a listen to John Hynes' post-game remarks after a win over the Toronto Maple Leafs 2-1 in OT. We'll talk about the need for the Wild to be very methodical with their handling of the puck in the D zone and not letting special team struggles bleed into the rest of the game. So some good stuff from John Hynes here for today's game. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021 and credentialed media member, and the wins just keep coming. The Wild just keep finding ways to pick up wins, and second place in the Central, second most points in the Western Conference. What's not to like about an 8-1-2 start so far this season? There's a lot. And the best part, I think, is that the Wild are finding ways to win games even without having their best stuff on a night-to-night basis. There have been some games this year where the Wild have controlled the action for the most part. But there have been others where it seems like the opponent is able to get a little mojo going, and the Wild just find a way. And I think a lot of that is due to what John Hynes has preached all season in terms of mindset and mentality for this Minnesota Wild team. We'll talk about that coming up in today's show. But I wanted to start with a look at something that has been a big key for this Minnesota Wild team, especially over the last few games, is readjustments. You go into the first intermission, maybe you're down by a couple of goals. Make a couple of adjustments, come out swinging in the second period. John Hynes is a big believer that sometimes all it takes is just saying, here's what we're doing, here's what we need to do, and he credits the team so far for being very receptive to the things that he has suggested and the coaching staff have suggested in terms of things to work on when the next period begins.
You've been winning games where Kirill Kaprizov at points was putting your team on his back. Tonight, different game. Tight, low scoring, physical, and you still find a way to win it.
Yeah, I thought tonight was well played by both teams. It was a hard game to play. I think both teams played with pretty strong structure. Both teams had good pushes at certain times in the game. And, to me, the big thing is I thought we had a good start to the game, better than what we had talked about the last game we played. I thought we got on our heels a little bit after the penalty kills. I thought they had a little bit of momentum in the second. What I really liked about the game is in the second we got a little bit disconnected, and they gained momentum. But then we talked about some things in between the third period, and what I continually want to emphasize with the team is the ability to, in between periods, like, okay, here's what's going on, here's what we need to do. And the players' mindset, like they're attentive, they're ready, they go out and they execute. And I thought in the third period, we played a much more connected game with our breakout structure, our ability to make plays, pop plays, good five-man support. And I thought I really liked our third period. But probably more importantly, I just like the fact that we can analyze what's going on in a game, and the players have the mindset to go back out, refocus, and do what needs to be done.
It's all about finding those areas that need to be tweaked and just throwing the suggestions out there, and credit to the team for taking it and running with it so far this season. There have been plenty of instances where, especially on the road, you run into a Florida Panthers team or a Tampa Bay Lightning who control the action for stretches of periods. But this Wild team has done a very good job of adjusting and coming out swinging when the intermission breaks are done. There have been a handful of instances so far this season in which the Wild have scored go-ahead goals or have tied the score within the first couple of minutes of the next period. The game against the Tampa Bay Lightning, for example, that exact same thing happened in the third period after the Wild rallied to get things to, or in the second period when the Wild had rallied to tie the score at 2-2. Right out of the gates in the second period, they get the goal to take a 3-2 lead, and then they add to it. So they're finding ways to be able to exploit their opponent and to be able to do what they need to do to take the upper hand. And especially in the goals department, they have just found ways to get that next goal that they need to be able to tie the score, to be able to take the lead. Think of the number of times this Wild team this year has found the way to go into a intermission break with a tie score as opposed to trailing. The game against Pittsburgh, the Wild fell behind early. They were able to rally back to tie. The game against Philly, the Wild were behind early, and they rallied to be able to tie. Those are all the benchmarks of a team that is capable of making adjustments and capable of taking the best punch that the opponent has and being able to weather that and then go on the offensive themselves. We'll talk more about the notion of kind of going on the offensive here as the episode unfolds. But you look at the Wild so far this season, they are in positive territory in every single period so far this year. Early part of the season, it was the first period. And up until the last few games, the Wild had only allowed one goal in the first period all season. Now teams are starting to kind of figure that out. So what do the Wild do? They come out in the second period, and that has been the one where they've really been able to get separators, outscoring their opponents so far 13-7 in the second period so far this season. And even in the third, 16-12, a +4 in the goals department. But the thing that I like is the number of shots in the third period. The Wilds are outshooting their opponent 111-96. Now, it's not a huge margin, but it does tell you that they are controlling the play in the third, which is exactly when you want to see the Wild start to kind of smell blood in the water, taste blood in the water, and get to the point where they can really go do something about it. So being able to adjust is a key for any team. The good ones are able to take coaching and adapt and adjust to it. And the teams that don't are the teams that have seasons like the Wild had last year, where it seemed like they just were always under the 8 ball. They were always behind. And some of the other numbers too, like look at this breakdown for the Minnesota Wild so far this season. They're 6-0-2 in scoring first, but they're 2-1 in games in which the opponent scores first. The Wild are 5-0-1 when leading after one period. They're 5-0-0 when leading after 2, but when trailing after 1, they're 1-1, and when the score is tied, they're 2-0-1. So these games are right there for the taking, and the Wild have done a good job of being able to go out in the offensive and get the job done and come away with wins. So adjustments, finding the areas that need to be tweaked, and making some subtle changes to improve performance has been a big key for this Minnesota Wild team so far this season. There have been plenty of areas that have been pretty good, but can certainly be worked on as the season unfolds. We'll talk about puck possession in the D zone as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Plus, Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to enjoy today. And you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we will have you covered for tonight's game against the Los Angeles Kings. So make sure to join us for another Locked on Wild postcast after the Wild take on Kevin Fiala and the Los Angeles Kings at XL Energy Center here this evening. Wild trying to get win number 9 on the season. We'll see, win or lose, we cruise into another Locked on Wild postcast. So we talked about the notion of adjustments. That's been a big key to the John Hynes tenure since even taking over last year for the fired Dean Evison. And I thought it was interesting that Hynes talked about some of the things that broke down a little bit against the Toronto Maple Leafs. But one big one that he discussed is something that has certainly been a bit of an eye-opener over the last few games is just puck control in the D zone.
From a layman standpoint, like what were the big adjustments? Because obviously I think they had one offensive zone draw in the entire third period, so they couldn't even get into the zone. And it just wasn't your breakouts. I mean, it felt like you had a third man high that was basically breaking up everything in the neutral zone, and it was pretty.
Yeah, you know, I think a big thing is that in the second there were multiple opportunities where we didn't have good puck support in our own zone, and then we didn't get out. And then what happens is then you get hemmed in, and then you just constantly in line changes, and you can't get more on the attack. We were much more connected in the third period with our low center support, our D-men. We made plays. We were able to come out through the middle. Now you're on the attack, and then you have strong structure from an offensive perspective that we're in the offensive zone. I thought we made good decisions. But then in the O zone, our F3 was strong. I thought our D were gaps. We didn't give up a lot on the odd man. But you can, on the odd man rush situation, or allow them to come with speed. But it all stems from how you can play up the ice to set your game up in the offensive zone, and then the best defense is offense, and then we were strong in that area in the offensive zone coming back if we did lose possession of the puck.
I really like that because I think that's been one thing that, especially last year, early on, and even over the last couple of seasons, it just feels like the Wild's get pinned on their end of the ice way too often. And I really like John Hynes' explanation of why that happens. And he's exactly right, is when you get pinned on defense and you end up taking long shifts, then the only thing that you are really focused on is getting the puck out of your end so that you can create a change to bring in new players. And while you're doing that, the other team is gathering the puck. And guess what? They are mounting another charge to try to go right back into their offensive zone. And it's just a vicious cycle that leads to just constantly chasing, because you are constantly just worrying about, geez, such and such player has been on the ice for almost 2 minutes. We got to make sure that we get it clear so that that player can get off the ice, so we can get some fresh legs out on the ice. And then that becomes your entire focus, as opposed to going on the attack, going on the offensive and trying to push things into the offensive zone. And that has been something that so far this year, the Wilds have, with the exception of a couple of games, they've done a really good job of being able to take the best shot that the team has from an offensive perspective and flip the puck and push it up the ice to be able to get the offense set in and to get the other team in that same amount of in that same mind frame that now they're having to try to figure out how to get fresh skaters on the ice. It happened to Toronto a couple of times. Long shifts. And then all of a sudden you've got tired legs out there, and that's when mistakes happen. So I thought that was a really good assessment by John Hynes of, when you get pinned on your own end of the ice, it takes you more than just getting the puck out of the zone. It takes you more than that, because you then have to go from, okay, let's get fresh skaters on here. You got to then flip it past that to, let's get fresh skaters and let's go on the offensive ourselves. The best defense is a good offense. That's music to my ears. We heard really nothing like that under Dean Evison. It was just a more physical, more grinded out type style than what the Minnesota Wild are currently playing. And the personnel really haven't changed all that much. It's just a matter of John Hynes realizing that in order to win in this league, you got to try to at least match what the other really good teams are doing in this league. You can't try to slow them down, because your odds of being successful are not particularly good if you're trying to be the exception as opposed to the rule. So really interesting stuff. And on the puck handling side, this is something that I'm learning more and more just by watching this team do their thing and execute their toil. I remember when John Hynes first took over, and he talked a lot about being predictable. And I heard that and I kind of eye rolled, because I'm like, oh, great. This means that this is just going to be, your standard, like, we're going to just do everything pretty bland. And there is still some of that with this year's team. But by and large, I think by being predictable, that allows players, when they have the puck on the D zone, to know where the outlets are going to be, to know where the passing lanes are going to be able to quickly get the puck out of the zone so that you don't end up getting pinned and you don't end up having to spend large stretches of time defending on the D zone, because the more time you spend on D, the better likelihood there is that the opponent is going to score a goal. And if you can do anything, no matter how minute, if you can do anything to flip it and to push the other team on their heels, that is more of an opportunity for you to score goals as well. So really, really interesting from John Hynes there, in just his mindset, his mentality about why it's important to not get pinned because then it takes you longer to get yourself back on offense. I really like that. We will finish today's show talking about the special teams, because the special teams, as you heard in yesterday's show for the everydayers, special teams not super great right now, but John Hynes has some key words on that as well. We'll finish the show after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy, so that your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, Prize Picks keeps your lineup live. So head to the app, download it today, and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to check out Locked On NHL as well for my weekly appearance, talking about the Colorado Avalanche and the Minnesota Wild and how they have been able to get off to as good of a start as they have so far this season. So Locked On NHL, your second listen today, available on your favorite podcast platforms. Look, we've seen over the last few games, the power play has not been executing at the same level that it had at the start of the season. I mean, it was an over 30% power play for the first probably 5 games of the year. And now things have started to tail off. And the penalty kill, not great so far this season. But John Hynes has some wise words about the need to move on. If you have an unsuccessful power play, move on. If you have an unsuccessful penalty kill, move on. Because it can be that your lack of production on the power play or lack of success on the penalty kill can bleed into other parts of the game.
Are you concerned not scoring on the 4-minute power play that could come back and cost the team, or did you feel it was still pretty even?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the game 5-on-5 was fairly even. Obviously, you'd like to be able to score in that situation. We didn't, but that's another. There's times where we are going to score in those situations, but you got to play the game that you're in. And again, the other component too, I feel, is that our power play is very effective. But I would say from a team perspective and the power play guys' perspective, sometimes if you don't have success with scoring the power play, it can bleed into the power play's players' frustration or your team. And right now, we just go out and play. If we don't score on that power play, the next guys that weren't on the power play, they go out and play. Power play guys, they're okay. They refocus. They're right back into the 5-on-5, and that's, to me, all the little components of finding ways to win games, win tight games, win hard games. It's all these little moments that we're trying to continue to grow.
Seems like that might have been a problem for last year's Minnesota Wild team. But John Hynes, again, has made it his full emphasis to make sure that the team is moving on, whether you have success or not. And I have heard from other coaches in other sports just how important it is to stay even keel. If everything is going according to plan for you and you are beating the brakes off of the opponent, even keel. If you're getting throttled by your opponent, even keel. Guess what? throughout the course of the NHL season, there's going to be plenty that does not go according to plan for this Minnesota Wild team. But by living for the next play, that is going to allow them to be better handled to make comebacks when adversity strikes. We saw it against Philadelphia. They didn't end up being able to get the win in that game, but look at what has happened since. Fell behind 2-0 against Pittsburgh and rallied to be able to come away with that win by just shrugging it off and just continuing to attack and continuing to push and continuing to do all the things that have become staples of this year's Minnesota Wild team. Against the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Lightning scored first. Minnesota Wild rallied to tie in the second and then took the game over in the third period for good. Battling through adversity, staying even keel. I think in a different timeline, John Hynes would be a pretty darn good sports psychologist. These mantras and mentalities it's all sports psychology. And confidence takes a big hit when you're not playing well. But if you have put yourself in the notion of, if I don't score here, I'm just going to, next time I'm on the ice, I'm just going to do exactly what I was doing and just try to go out there and score that time. You put yourself in position to be able to handle adversity. And the Wild last year, early on in the season, they didn't handle adversity well at all. And over the last few seasons, it seems like the adversity has been something that has been a little tough for the Wild to be able to handle fully. But now this year, falling behind in games, Spurgeon and Eriksson Ek not available to start the road trip, next man up, next play, move on to the next and just try to do whatever you need to do to come away with the win. So being able to not let adverse special teams performances bleed into what is happening in 5-on-5, that's going to be a big key for this team as the season unfolds. The power play will get back on track. I hope that the penalty kill will start to put quality performances together and start to stack them so that that percentage doesn't read in the 60s. Maybe is able to get up to somewhere in the 80s. Would be just wonderful, but I'll even take high 70s at this point. But by not allowing that to bleed into the rest of the game, the Wild are putting themselves in position to, hey, let's shake it off and move on to the next thing. These are all things that I just really have been impressed with so far from John Hynes. Hearing all of this, seeing how he attacks opponents, it's all very good. Is that to say that there isn't anything that can be improved? Absolutely not, because there is. But you put yourself in a much different position when you are able to bank wins and continue to tally points even when everything doesn't go according to plan. I like to just take a little bit of a snapshot as to where this team was at last year at this time. In game 11 of the season last year, the Minnesota Wild beat the New York Rangers 5-4 in a shootout to improve to 4-5-2 on the season. And that snapped a 4-game losing streak. But you look at what happened with last year's Minnesota Wild team. Started off strong against Florida. Philip Gustafson stood on his head. Things fall apart against Toronto. You bounce back and beat Montreal. Then you lose to Los Angeles. You lose to Columbus. You fight your way back and beat Edmonton 7-4. And then 4 straight losses. You win the game against the Rangers and the game against the Islanders to improve to 5-5-2. And guess what? 7 straight losses after that. Last year's Minnesota Wild team did not handle adversity well at all. This year's Minnesota Wild team just continues to find a way. And that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day and continuing to follow along with us as the season rolls along. We will have you covered each and every day, and we'll have you covered after tonight's game as well. So make sure to tune in for yet another Locked On Wild postcast coming here this evening. The Minnesota Wild 8-1-2 on the season. We'll see if they can make it 9 against the Los Angeles Kings here this evening. Make sure to subscribe if you have not already so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.